everyone, welcome to the next part of my in-depth series on how to play Warhammer 40K 7th edition. As always, my name is Jay, and today we will be talking about deployment, the beginning of the game of Warhammer 40K. Specifically, how to deploy your miniatures. We'll be talking about infiltrating and scouts, and a little bit about reserves. Now the next video will be covering the reserve phase, so I won't be going into too much depth, but I will be talking about reserves as well, and basically then it's time to play the game. So let's start about deployment. So now you've got your armies, you're ready to go. By this point you should have rolled to see what type of game you're playing, you should know the mission, and you should know the deployment type. The board should be completely set up. And just to summarize, typically there are three different types of deployments. There's Dawn of War, which is pretty much the standard one, which is the long table edge, and you get a foot from your long table edge to deploy. There is Hammer and Anvil, which is basically sides. You get this, a 4-foot by 2-foot deployment zone, and it's actually the short table sides is your side. And then there's Vanguard Strike, which is table corners. And you should already know which one you're doing before this step. So now it's time to deploy your miniatures. So basically there's two rules when it comes to deployment. First rule is that all your models, any model that is put on the table for deployment, has to be entirely within the deployment zone, unless it has the rule of infiltrate, which I will be discussing in a few moments. Another big change to Warhammer 40K 7th edition is fortifications. Fortifications used to be able to be placed anywhere in your table half and were placed prior to the models in your army. That rule is gone now, so now they act just as a normal model in your army, so they are placed during your deployment phase and have to be placed entirely within your deployment zone. So please take that in consideration when purchasing fortifications for your army in Warhammer 40K. So basically, if you're playing Dawn of War like this, as you can see the table now is marked off by dice. This is our deployment zone. So any model deployed on the table during the deployment phase will have to be entirely within that deployment zone. Now this can be a pretty daunting task, seeing as some armies might have a lot of miniatures. But that being said, you don't actually have to start with all your miniatures on the table at the beginning of the game. They can be placed in what's called reserves. And now models in reserve basically are going to come on in future turns. Most armies have access to their reserves from turn 2 onwards. However, some armies have actual access to their reserves from turn 1 onwards, such as Dark Angels, any army that uses drop pods, or Grey Knights. All of them have access to their reserves turn 1. That being said, some models have to start in reserves. For example, any drop pod has to be put in reserves because there's a special rule regarding drop pods. And flyers. Flyers have to start the game in reserve as well. One of the big changes between 6th edition and 7th edition 40K is that in 6th edition you could only put up to half your army in reserves. That rule is gone. So now you put your entire army in reserves if you want. However, you have to take this one rule into consideration. Remember, in Warhammer 40K 7th edition, if at the end of any game turn, you or your opponent has no more models on the table, that person loses. So if you start all your models in reserve and you can't get them on turn 1, you lose. Because at the end of turn 1, you won't have any models on the table and your opponent automatically wins. So please take that into consideration. And once again, I will be going over the reserve phase in the next video. Another of the rules that you have to take into consideration with deployment is coherency, and that is a word that you'll be hearing a lot when playing Warhammer 40K. Any unit put on the table, such as these tactical marines from the Dark Angels faction of Space Marines, they have to be placed in coherency when being deployed. So what that means is that each model has to be within 2 inches or at most 2 inches away from another member of that squad. That way they're in coherency. I will be discussing coherency once again in the movement phase. So that basically sums up deployment. Basically all the models that you decide to deploy have to be placed entirely in your deployment zone. And they have to be placed in coherency. All the other models that you want can start in reserves, but there's also a third option. The third option is called Infiltrate. Now, Infiltrate only applies to models which have the special rule Infiltrate, and to find out which models of yours have the special rule Infiltrate, go to the specific entry in the codex, and it will say whether or not they have Infiltrate. Infiltrate is most commonly used by scouts for Space Marine factions, or maybe these Gene Stealers for the Tyranid army. They have a rule called Infiltrate, and what Infiltrate allows them to do is they can actually be placed outside of their deployment zone at the beginning of the game, and here's why. Now, when deploying your forces, once again, you have to tell your opponent which models will start on the table, which models will start in reserves, and which ones will infiltrate. So the opponent has the best knowledge possible. And what infiltrating does, essentially, you can start outside your deployment zone if you wish, but there are rules. Now, if any of the models from your opponent's army can draw a line of sight, so basically a straight line, and see any model from the squad that is infiltrating, they can be placed at least 18 inches away from your opponent's models. So at least 18 inches away. But that still is a smaller gap than the normal deployment zones, which basically start 24 inches away from your opponent. However, if your opponent cannot draw a line of sight, which can happen based on terrain, for example, if these models are hiding behind this rock, in this case, and they cannot have a line of sight drawn to them, they can start at least 12 inches away from your opponent. So now, they are only 12 inches away from your opponent, and that gives them a great shot of doing some damage to them the next game turn. There are some restrictions, though, on what they can do. If you infiltrate any models, those models that infiltrated cannot assault the turn that they infiltrate. So if they assault in before the game, they cannot assault turn 1, because that'd be just too unfair. If they started 12 inches away from your opponent and they could assault, they would go in and assault them turn 1 and cause some mischief. So that is a rule. Now, sometimes both you and your opponent could have models that have the infiltrate special rule, and if this is the case, you roll a dice each. Whoever rolls higher can decide who deploys their infiltrators first. And once you deploy a squad, then I would deploy a squad, and then you deploy a squad, and then I deploy a squad, until all the squads are deployed on the table. So now we've gone over deployment, reserves, and infiltrate. The last thing we should discuss in the deployment part of the game is scout movements. Now, some of your models may also have a rule called scout. For example, these Ravenwing Bikers from the Dark Angels faction have the rule scout. And what scout essentially lets them do is, scout allows you to redeploy your models in the deployment, at the end of the deployment phase. And what scout essentially allows you to do is redeploy. Now the key is the word redeploy, which is different from move. And the reason why it is a very different word is because some guns in Warhammer 40K act differently of whether or not you moved. And what scout allows you to do is redeploy, so it does not count as moved for the purposes of firing these guns. And what scout allows you to do is redeploy 6 inches if you're a standard infantry or a monstrous creature or something slow. You get to move up to 6 inches redeployment. And this redeployment can take you out of your deployment zone after it is done. So you can actually move 6 inches towards your opponent. However, faster models, so basically anything else other than infantry and monstrous creatures, can actually move 12 inches. So these Ravenwing, as I mentioned, they have scout, they're not standard infantry, they can move 12 inches, and they can be redeployed 12 inches in any direction they wish, which could take them 12 inches out of their deployment zone. However, once again, there are rules for scout. First of all, you can't finish your redeployment closer than 12 inches from the closest model of your opponent. So once again, you have to start at least 12 inches away from your opponent. And the second one, similar to infiltrate, anybody who scouts cannot assault turn 1. Pretty standard stuff, because once again, these bikers would start so close that they just jump in, assault things, and it'd be pretty unfair towards your opponent. They'd have nothing to do, and that'd be too fair for Warhammer 40K 7th edition. And once again, in a similar fashion to infiltrate, if you and your opponents both have scouts, you once again roll off, and the winner decides which guy's scouts get to move first, and they move, and then you move one squad at a time until all the squads have scouted on the table. So, we've covered it now. So the first part is deployment. Second, you have to decide what goes in reserves, what starts on the table. And then there's infiltrators, And finally, scout movements. And at the end of this, you're good to play the game. So let's go over what we just learned with this small Dark Angels army, consisting of a squad of tactical marines, a small squad of Raven Wing bikers, and a small squad of Terminators, and a captain for the HQ slot. So, my opponent and I roll off, and I win. I decide that I am going to deploy first. So when it's my turn to deploy, I have to decide who will start on the table and who will enter in reserves. And I decide that the Tactical Marines and the Captain and the Raven Wing are going to start on the table, and I deploy them entirely in my deployment zone and in coherency. I decided that the Terminators are going to start in reserve. And that's it. Then my opponent deploys. And when my opponent is done deploying, it's now time to decide who's going first. And the person whoever deployed first can choose whether or not to go first or second. Most of the time, whoever deploys first will want to go first for tactical purposes. The next part is the infiltration step. And my opponent is playing Tyranids, and he has a squad of Gene Stealers. And he tries to deploy them 18 inches away from my Tactical Marines. Since my Tactical Marines can draw line of sight to them, they can only go 18 inches or farther away from the Tactical Marines. And after the infiltrating step is done, next begins the scout phase. And as I mentioned, my Raven Wing have the scout special rule. So I decide to redeploy them 12 inches towards my opponent, finishing once again 12 inches away from them and a completely legal distance away from my opponent at the beginning. And that's it. So now we're completely ready to play Warhammer 40K 7th edition. The only thing left though is seize the initiative. So if my opponent wants to try to take that first turn away from me, he can roll a dice. And on a 6, he takes first turn away from me. But on anything other than a 6, I still get to go first, and that begins the game of Warhammer 40K. So thank you very much for watching this episode of How to Play Warhammer 40K. Please leave a comment in the comment section down below if you felt I missed anything, or if you want to add anything to the conversation. It's greatly appreciated. So thank you, and stay tuned for the next part where I will be going over the reserve phase of Warhammer 40K 7th edition. So thank you very much once again. Until next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting, everyone.